Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along to the Dementia Knowledge Network for July already. I will just do the acknowledgement of country and then I'll throw to Sarah to introduce our guest speaker today. So our meeting is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Sarah, over to you.
So our guest speaker today is Dr. Monica Cations. Monica is a clinical psychology registrar and epidemiologist who's worked with people with young onset dementia for many years. Her research is translational with a focus on improving the accessibility and quality of post-diagnosis care for people with young onset dementia. So welcome, Monica. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation. I'll just share some slides here if I'm allowed to. See, so it's telling me I can't. I think you need to make me a host or something, Sarah. So I can. It says you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. I don't know what that means. You're sharing computer sound. That's why you need to stop sharing that. There we go. Okay, all good. Share. Okay, can everybody see that? Beautiful, wonderful. Okay, so yes, thank you for having me. So I'm a senior research fellow down here in Adelaide at Flinders University, supported by a couple of fellowships, but I also work clinically as a registered psychologist in private practice, and most of my clients in my private practice are older people and people living with some kind of dementia. All right, so I'll start with stuff that I'm sure all of you already know, but that, young onset dementia, as you would all know, is a dementia with symptom onset prior to 65 years, and that young onset dementia is a very diverse umbrella, that etiologies of young onset dementia are more diverse than among older people with dementia, but Alzheimer's disease is still the most common type of dementia among younger people. But more kind of unusual presentations are also more common in younger people. So non-amnestic presentations, non-memory related presentations are much more common among young people. Things like sensory changes, personality changes, executive functioning changes and language changes are common early symptoms, and this can confuse doctors and healthcare professionals and can contribute to delays to the diagnosis. The other important thing young onset dementia is that dementias in which responsive behaviours and neuropsychiatric symptoms are more common among younger people. So dementias like frontotemporal dementias, alcohol-related dementias, these dementias are often characterised by behaviour change, and that contributes to some of the post-diagnostic challenges that we face as professionals caring for people with dementia. So young onset dementia doesn't quite meet the criteria for a rare disease, but it's pretty close. We know that we have around about 29,000 people living in Australia with young onset dementia, so it's not uncommon, but also not as common as late life dementia. And so, something that's quite pertinent to what I'm going to talk about today is that people with young onset dementia, in terms of their risk profiles and the modifiable risks that kind of put them at high risk of young onset dementia, are more complex than older people. Young people are more likely to have experienced cumulative exposure to risk factors over their lifetime, and a lot of these risk factors, a lot of this cumulative risk exposure is more common in more marginalised groups. For example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, who are far more likely to develop dementia in midlife than non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Some research that my team has done has demonstrated that people with young onset dementia quite often have this history of sort of snowballing risks. They grow up in poverty, or they grow up experiencing adverse childhood events, which lead them to not achieve as much education as their peers, which maybe leads to ongoing low socioeconomic activities, maybe leads to high levels of drug and alcohol use, which maybe leads to cardiovascular problems, and on and on and on we go. And so what this means is that we get quite complex pathways to onset of young onset dementia in many cases. And that continues after the onset of dementia, that young people with dementia continue to have complex care needs and complex lives following their diagnosis. Not all the time, but more often than among older people. So what I'm going to talk about today is I guess, what my research is about, what my expertise sort of lie on, which is about post-diagnosis young onset dementia care and support. I've been in this field for a while now. I actually used to work at Dementia Australia, so lovely to have some people from Dementia Australia here today. And that was my first kind of stepping into this world of post-diagnostic young onset dementia care. And as you would all know, most service delivery for this population was delivered via the aged care sector until about 2016. And up until this time, I did some research during my PhD that demonstrated that up to 70% of young people with dementia and their families were not using services that were recommended to them and that were available to them. And the reasons for that were diverse, but very often specifically related to their age. Things like, well, there's no available childcare when that service is happening, so I can't, so we can't benefit from it. Or it's not, that carer support service is not available after hours when I'm not working. Or there are eligibility criteria that I'm not 65 yet, so I can't get access. But also preference-based barriers as well, that, look, I don't want to go and access a service where I'm surrounded by 80 and 90-year-olds. It doesn't feel right for me, and we know from research that receiving a service that isn't really designed for you can be associated with worse outcomes, and we certainly heard that from people with young onset dementia that we spoke to. But of course, in 2017, young onset dementia was confirmed as an eligible condition under the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which was fantastic. As you all know, people with YOD can access the NDIS as long as they make an application or an access request before their 65th birthday. And then after this time, they can stay on the NDIS until they die, or they can choose to move to the aged care sector after they turn 65 years. But I do understand that even that is quite complex, that there are some circumstances that force people to move over to aged care when maybe they don't want to. And of course, if a person's diagnosis is delayed or their access to the NDIS is delayed, then they can miss out if they age over 65 with their condition. As far as I understand it, and this as well seems to change all the time, but most facilities have a co-funding model within residential aged care that's co-funded by aged care and the NDIS, but I understand that there are moves to change that as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is this kind of concern about nexus care. So nexus care is this idea, or is this the circumstance that people find themselves in where they sit at the intersection of two very complex and very different systems, care systems. And so in the Australian context, most people with progressive neurological disorders like dementia, like Parkinson's disease, like motor neuron disease and other conditions like this will age over 65 years with their condition. The vast majority of people with young onset dementia in Australia experience the onset of that dementia between 60 and 64 years of age. And so most of them will age over 65 with that condition. We also know that people with lifelong disabilities are living longer and are increasingly aging over 65 as well, and so are increasingly interfacing with the aged care system when they may not have been in the past. But what's important about that is that the disability care system in Australia and the aged care system are fundamentally different systems in almost every way. So the disability system really works on the social model of disability, is built on the social model of disability that recognises that disability or disadvantage is sustained against people with disability because of the structures and the community around them. The disability system is strongly goal-based and recovery-focused, really espouses the idea of rehabilitation. How well they actually implement that in practice, we could debate about, but but that's the stated aim of the disability system and of the NDIS. The disability system provides individualised funding packages that are allocated per person, you know, that they can use based on whatever their needs are. The disability system is often quite person-driven, depending on how much that person wants it to be person-driven, that they're sort of, they have this funding package and they kind of just decide and determine what needs they have and how they want to use that money. And in general, the disability system has a fairly low level of interface with the healthcare system, particularly when a person with a disability doesn't have ongoing or complex healthcare needs. It might be relatively infrequent, or, you know, that person may access healthcare services just like the rest of us do through their GP or whatever. In the aged care system, things are different. So the aged care system still works primarily on a more biomedical model, a more deficit palliative approach to things, that, you know, as you are getting more and more frail, more and more ill, we provide compensatory supports to kind of keep you going and manage things, but with the ultimate sense that, you know, this is a life limiting, this is, you know, this is care to support you as you're dealing with life limiting problems. There's still this provision of block funding in some cases, again, complex, but that provides a little bit of flexibility about how aged care providers use that money. The aged care system works on a consumer-directed care model. My question mark there, you know, again, how well that actually, how consumer-directed it actually is always a question mark. But in general, the aged care system, particularly in residential aged care, has quite a high level of healthcare interface, because older people accessing aged care generally have high levels of healthcare needs. They'll often be, you know, most facilities will have doctors that come to the facility quite regularly. And so there's more of that interface between the aged care and the healthcare system. So these are two very, very different systems. And of course, they both have their individual assessment processes that go along with accessing them, which can often be very similar, very overlapping between the two systems. So when you're a person who has to traverse both, plus the healthcare system, you know, there can be this huge gap that is created in between them, where you know, the person really is at risk of falling between this gap and not being able to capitalise on the respective strengths of each sector. So the disability sector and the aged care sector have their respective strengths and weaknesses, of course. We often think that aged care has nothing but weaknesses, but actually there are some real strengths of the aged care sector for people with young onset dementia. You know, the aged care sector has a long history of experience with dementia care. Dementia care is core business in aged care. Whereas in the disability sector, dementia is new. Dementia is a new concept for most of the disability workforce. They haven't had to provide dementia care in the past. So, you know, that's quite a difference in expertise and experience. The aged care sector sometimes is provided with block funding that can be used for kind of widespread training activities. Obviously, they have lots of residential aged care services, which are often built purposely for people with dementia. And like I said before, they have, you know, relatively good health system interface, not perfect, but better than other areas. Whereas the disability system, that has its pros as well. You know, this provision of individualised goal-directed funding is really appreciated by most people with disability and people with young onset dementia, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There's heaps of provision of allied health support in the disability system, which is fantastic. We know is associated with good outcomes for people with dementia. You can get tailored support, actually tailored to what you need. And sometimes you can get access to specialist and well-designed and tailored accommodation and housing sometimes. But both of these sectors also have their cons, right? They both have their drawbacks, that you know, it can be quite difficult for a person with dementia, particularly in the very early stages of that dementia, to access the NDIS because of that rule that you have to have a significant disability. If a person, you know, is very early stages, they may not have disabilities that are significant enough to warrant access to the NDIS. There's obviously these age limits, and there's this kind of race against time to get access. The disability system has limited dementia experience and expertise, and also has limited interface with the healthcare system. On the other hand, the aged care system is designed for older people. It's designed with older people in mind, and again has these eligibility requirements that make it difficult to accommodate people who are younger than 65. And so in this kind of landscape, a person with young onset dementia in their family doesn't get to access the benefits of both systems very easily. It's quite complex to do that. And in many ways, the areas in which the disability sector is not so good could be really supported and maintained if they were able to tap into the support from the aged care sector, but it's not very easy to do this. So in 2020, we wanted to know what people with young onset dementia, what their experiences with the NDIS had been so far. So it had been about 3 years since the NDIS became available to young people with dementia, and there was no research out there about how they were going. So we surveyed a group of 156 young people with dementia or their carers or care partners across Australia. And in this case, at that point, about 85% of them knew what the NDIS was and knew that young onset dementia was an eligible condition in the NDIS. About 70% had made a request, and a small proportion of those had been knocked back because, like I said before, because their disabilities or impairments were not deemed to be significant enough to meet the criteria for the NDIS, which is a huge problem because, you know, as we all know, access to early intervention is very important for promoting good outcomes for young people with dementia. Among those who, about 50% of people had received an approved plan and had access services at that point. So we were interested to know how long people had to wait from first contacting the NDIS to receiving their approved plan among those people who did get an approved plan. And we found that 2/3 of people waited more than 3 months for that process, and about a third waited more than 6 months, which is a very long time when you are trying to access supports and services to maintain contact with your community. We asked participants a range of questions about their experiences with the NDIA, so the agency that delivers the NDIS, and also their experiences with disability services. And so what we found was this kind of fairly negative, overall experience with the NDIA, the sense that, the NDIS themselves, the funding body, don't really understand dementia. They don't really understand the cognitive needs and the behavioural needs that young people with dementia have. Most people agree that it's quite difficult to access NDIS funding. It takes a long time. But among those people who did get a plan, most of them were relatively happy with that plan. In terms of accessing services with that money, again, there was a fairly negative picture about kind of relatively low satisfaction with the disability workforce and the disability services that were available out there. Fairly low levels of a sense that disability providers really understand dementia, and that it continues to be difficult for young people with dementia and their families to find service providers with which to use their NDIS funding. And that was a key message from all of our research before the rollout of the NDIS, that even if I get access to funding, it's almost impossible for me to find a suitable service with which to use that funding, or a service that's been designed specifically for my needs. And that problem seems to be continuing after the availability of the NDIS. But as you can see at the bottom there, that there was a sense that neither disability providers or aged care providers are particularly good at responding to the needs of young people with dementia. Having said all of this, we also asked some more conceptual questions about the inclusion of young people with dementia in the NDIS. And overwhelmingly, people with young onset dementia and their families were very positive about their inclusion in the NDIS. That, things are better for me since the NDIS was rolled out. I get more support now. If I can't access the NDIS, I wish I could. And these two questions down the bottom, which I think are really important. fundamentally, our participants agree that young onset dementia belongs in the NDIS instead of the aged care sector. So even though the actual experience of accessing care and receiving care hasn't improved that much, people fundamentally believe that this is a good move. It's a good move. This is where I belong. I fundamentally believe in the philosophy of the NDIS, or maybe I fundamentally disagree with the philosophy of the aged care sector. The overall assessment we kind of took from this was that this is really good in theory, but there's lots of room for improvement in practice. And I guess that's warranted given, you know, the NDIS was very young at this time, and there were lots of teething issues at this time, and probably still are. So what are the current barriers to best outcomes for people with young onset dementia? Well, since, you know, since the kind of recent move away from delivering a young onset dementia specific support coordination service, unfortunately, there are no routinely accessible navigational support services. And so I mean here specialized ones that are just for people with young onset dementia and are kind of routinely, widely accessibly available. Of course, there's still the National Dementia Helpline and other Dementia Australia services, but these are not specific to young onset dementia. Certainly here in Adelaide, I don't know about over there in Melbourne, but there's a real lack of NDIS pre-planning support. So people really knowing how to ask for what they need in those planning meetings with the NDIS. And this poses the risk of delayed or denied funding for people with young onset dementia. Still, we hear about, you know, fairly low expertise and experience with dementia in the disability sector among people providing services to young people with dementia. Still very few specialised services with whom to spend my funding. And again, this, you know, this is a kind of cost benefit problem, isn't it? That, you know, if we're talking here in Adelaide, there are a small number of people with young onset dementia in general. They're often geographically dispersed. And, you know, I need X number of them on my books in order to make a business case for providing a specialised service to them. That's a difficult you know, ask. There's limited appropriate housing. I know that you know, Sydney has a young onset dementia specific residential aged care facility. Maybe one in Melbourne, I'm not sure, but certainly nothing here. The problem of neuropsychiatric symptoms is an important one because, as you would all know, young people with dementia, you know, who have quite significant neuropsychiatric symptoms tend to bounce between services, and nobody really quite knows whose job it is. When is it older person's mental health's job? Is it you know, geriatric services? Is it their job? Is it, you know, adult psychiatric services? Like, whose job? Where do these people belong? And what, you know, what's the right environment for them, particularly when these symptoms are very chronic, very severe, and the risk is very high. And that's a highly marginalised population of people. There are a few opportunities for the aged care, healthcare and disability sectors to collaborate. I'm going to talk more about that today. And also there's a kind of diffusion of responsibility that happens. We've heard several examples of people, let's say, young onset dementia, leaving hospital, but nobody agreeing on whose job it is to pay for the accommodations that the person needs. Is it the healthcare system's job? Is it the NDIS's job in order for them to go home and live independently? And that delays, you know, access to care. It delays their exit from hospital, and all sorts of problems happen at that interface. There's lots of duplicating assessments, people having to answer the same questions a bazillion times. What else? What have I missed? Maybe I'll open it up to the group. I'm sure there's a million different things that I've missed. You tell me from your experience over there in Melbourne.
I've had limited experience with NDIS, but I must admit that I've wondered about the training that they actually provide. I've had a family member who receives NDIS funding, and the case manager, I'd spoken to him about helping this person attend a funeral, And it was just quite pathetic because I actually said, look, this person is dying. And he basically said, well, when do you want me to book him for? And I said, well, he's not dead yet. He's on his last legs. I can't tell you when, because it was just like, I just felt that, is there no training provided to the people? And then last week I had to go and bring a lady into hospital who was acutely unwell, and she receives an NDIS package. She's got a primary mental illness, but there was a carer there that just sits with her for 2 hours and wouldn't even attempt to clear the dishes on the table or anything like that. And I'm thinking, well, what are you doing for 2 hours? She goes, oh, no, that's the cleaner's responsibility. That comes in once a week. And I'm thinking, it's kind of common sense.
Yeah.
This particular woman, normally supported by her aging mother, because her mother had been in hospital, she really unraveled, highly disorganized, not eating, not sleeping. But it's almost like, well, no, that's not my job. And I'm thinking, goodness gracious, this is, I mean, this demarcation of what is your job and what is it. So I'm actually, I don't feel like having an NDIS. Look, for some people, I'm sure it's wonderful, depending on, how it's managed.
And
but
so that's right. So there's, if we think about an NDIS care provider, even an NDIS planner, somebody who works at the NDIS, they might see one person with young onset dementia in their whole career. The vast majority of their clients are going to be people with intellectual disabilities, with autism, with other, quite stable.
Yes.
So, it's a very different presentation. Bernadette, you want to add something? Oh, we just can't hear you. We just can't hear you, Bernadette. You're on, I don't know why. Okay, that's all right. You can add anything you like in the chat.
Can I just clarify, Monica, in terms of definition, you said 65 and under is young onset, but as we know, sometimes the process of getting a diagnosis can take years. So is it 65 when you're diagnosed, or 65 when you first start showing signs of dementia? Because as we know, there's
symptoms of dementia.
Symptoms of dementia.
Symptoms of dementia, but the NDIS rules are that you need to have a diagnosis. To be able to access the NDIS. So even though we know that it can take 4 or 5 years for people to get a diagnosis.
Yeah.
All right. So everything I've a lot of what I've talked about so far, really, one of the kind of core, problems that young people with dementia and their families face is what's called care fragmentation. So this is where care services are delivered across multiple systems without the adequate coordination and communication between those systems. And so in this, in that kind of context, the person with dementia themselves or their care partner becomes the care coordinator, even if they don't have the skills and resources to take on that job. And so care fragmentation is, we know from the research it's associated with poor outcomes. It's associated with poorer care, the provision of unnecessary services, increased costs, increased risk of hospitalisation and premature entry to residential care. So care fragmentation is bad. The flip side of care fragmentation is integrated care. So integrated care seeks to improve connectivity across different parts of the care system. And in doing so, it aims to improve the experience of care and outcomes through delivering care in a way that's more coordinated and tailored to a person's needs and preferences. So integrated care is sort of a worldwide goal in care provision across healthcare, social care, aged care, all types of care. Integrated care means that care providers are collaborating, that they're not duplicating assessment processes unnecessarily, that a person is moving between services quite easily and fluidly, that there's high levels of communication between care providers, and that a person can be the driver of their own care, be in the driver's seat of their care experience, but not, it's like being in the driver's seat of their care experience, but with a map, you know, and, you know, with a Google map there, providing the support that they need. We can't drive our own care if we don't know where we're going. We don't know what exit to take. So, you know, we need this balance between I'm the driver of my own care, but I've also got the support, the resources, and the care that I need to help me do that, to facilitate that process. So integrated care, or efforts to improve the integration of care, you know, there's really so many of these, but really common ones are things like case management, providing individualized care plans, developing very strong care pathways. But often these activities occur within one system, you know, trying to improve the integration of healthcare, maybe between the hospital and the GP, you know, for example. But what about when you've got multiple systems involved? You've got the healthcare system and the aged care system and the disability system all involved at the same time. That's quite complicated. How do we improve integration of care in that context? And so we recently did a study, some research on this question about, you know, can learning collaboratives be an effective strategy for improving care integration for young people with dementia? So we put together collaborative care teams, or learning collaborative teams, which included a disability care organisation, an aged care organisation, and a local area coordinator within a small geographical area, so usually within a local government area. And so we established a number of these teams, and we provided them with a kind of team training program that they went through for 6 months, which involved them learning more about young onset dementia, but more importantly, learning about how to work together as a team to improve the delivery of care in that local area for the people who with young onset dementia who live there and access care there. What we found is that by doing this, you know, the group's knowledge, that the whole organisation's knowledge about young onset dementia improved, that interprofessional collaboration between those organisations improved, and people felt supported and collaborative. There was a reduction in the duplication of services, that, you know, the aged care provider and the disability provider realised they were providing the same service, and so there wasn't a need for that. You know, instead, let's establish clearer referral pathways between these providers so that, you know, we all fill a space that is needed, but we're not duplicating them, and much clearer communication pathways. There were barriers to these sort of positive outcomes, though. So where the representatives in the collaboratives, the representatives from the organisations within the collaboratives had limited power to actually make change within their organisation, so they were sort of frontline staff or whatever, that was a barrier to change. Things like staff turnover was a barrier to change, and sometimes when the ambitions of the collaborative group were too high, that was a barrier too. You know, they wanted to really change the world when that was not possible within their daily work and resources. And so, you know, from this we learned a lot about how, you know, current services could, you know, might go about improving the integration of care within their local region for young people with dementia. So, you know, we can recommend, if you can, creating your own collaborative by seeking out disability aged care providers in your local area and local area coordinators in your local area to work together and form a bit of a collaborative. Consider, when you're reaching out to find people to join your team, consider finding people who work at the coalface of the service, so do have client, you know, related interactions, but also have some power to enact change. So senior clinicians or senior managers or whatever, you know, are often good people for this, or senior nurses or whoever, because they kind of know what's happening on the ground, but they also can go back to management and say, this is what we need to do. Together as a team, you can conduct a needs assessment, which kind of identifies, right, what are we currently doing? What's the current processes and what's missing? What are the gaps? And that can inform the actions that you wish to take forward. You can create an action plan, you know, I'll send these slides so you can access an example that you can use, which is about, right, what's missing and how are we going to work towards filling some of these gaps. I very strongly advise you to consider not just sort of service gaps like, well, there's no social groups for young people with dementia or whatever. That's an important gap, but often it's the more process gaps that are more important. Like, well, when I get a referral, I don't know anything about this person's history, or I don't know, you know, whether who their support coordinator is or whatever, you know, these kind of breakdowns in the process that are often actually the bigger barriers to delivering best practice care than just that, you know, there's maybe not the service that the person wants. Take small and incremental steps towards filling these gaps. You know, often when people have tried to do too much too soon, you know, it takes a lot out of you psychologically to do that. And so really looking at small ways that we can work towards filling in these gaps is more conducive to success. Make sure you have a contingency plan so that if you leave or somebody else in the team leaves, that there's another person in the organization who's ready to pick it up and keep moving, so you can provide mentoring in that way. And have regular interprofessional team meetings, because it's a good way to feel supported and not so isolated in working with young people with dementia. But also it can help to you know, make that incremental change and keep working towards the shared goal that you might have between you. I won't go through that too much. And, you know, always keep in mind what are the kind of 5 key elements for an effective service for a young person with dementia. So these came from our research and have been validated a few times now. These are the things that young people with dementia want from their services and their family. They want services that are unique, so uniquely offered to young people with dementia, so they're specialised and created with that purpose in mind. They want services that are tailored and timely, so delivered at the right time in the right way. And you know, the only way you can find out what that time is by asking the person. Services need to be financially accessible, and recognising that young people with dementia and their families face extreme financial pressure from their illness. There's often a significant loss of income, a significant loss of superannuation and other issues. So, you know, do what you can to make those services financially accessible. Ensure that those services are flexible and work around the very busy lives that young people with dementia and their families have. And we also know that young people with dementia want to be meaningfully engaged in whatever they're doing. They want to contribute in some way. Most people with young onset dementia will have just come off of the peak of their professional lives, where they may have been CEOs or whatever they are. They've had this and really been giving a lot. And so this very swift kick into retirement can be a very psychologically challenging time. So anything we can do to provide some of the sense of achievement and meaning and contribution that work provides can be beneficial for young people with dementia. And just a very, very quick list here about how we can support disability providers to get it right, because like we've talked about, disability providers are generally inexperienced with this population and learning as they go. And so we can encourage them to learn as much as they can about young onset dementia. Keep a close eye on things, on people with young onset dementia, because the yearly NDIS review processes can be too infrequent to recognise changing needs and to provide, the timely support. Ask for feedback as much as they can. Get a sense about their role and how they might be able to fill the gaps within their local area. Offering rehabilitation and goal setting. That's what people with young onset dementia want. Look out for families, because they, the impacts of young onset dementia, as you all know, extend far beyond the person with dementia themselves, and collaborate as much as you can. All right, I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you all so much. And yeah, happy to answer any questions or any discussion.
Thanks so much, Monica. I'm just looking at your slide and wondering, are you expecting us to ask a stupid question?
I welcome them.
Or are there no stupid questions?
There are no stupid questions.
Bernadette just dropped into the chat because she can't be heard. That Dementia Australia do offer pre-planning for clients, and the local NDIS local area coordinator in Vic are improving their pre-planning.
Right.
She also asks that in Victoria, she's recently heard that NDIS will not automatically be lifelong after 65. Does anyone have a comment on that?
I have heard whispers of this, but nothing confirmed. So I see it on Twitter pop up every now and then. But generally what my understanding is that when those whispers come up, that if you dig a little deeper into the person's story, that there's actually some reason why they are being moved from the NDIS to aged care, because they need to access a service that is only, or whatever. So, you know, I haven't heard anything official that there's any plan to change that rule, but others may know more than I do.
Okay, thank you. And then one more comment from Bernadette was that she has had pushback from residential aged care facilities who will not take under 65s and require them to go to NDIS supported accommodation, which often is not suitable. I know from my own experience that it depends on the residential aged care provider individually whether or not they are willing to take people on NDIS packages and manage that into their you know, their budgets and funding streams and care facilities.
Yeah,
Is anyone...
even you know, I'm also aware of obviously this huge push to get young people out of aged care facilities by 2025, and this kind of investment in developing supported disability accommodation options. But I also, you know, have heard and sort of know that a lot of that is being designed for people with physical disabilities, and there's less of a kind of push for developing these accommodation options for people with cognitive disabilities. And you know, that's a concern for me as we, you know, this mandate comes for the end of 2025 to have all young people out of residential aged care, where, you know, sometimes residential aged care where people really know how to work with people with dementia, that actually can be the best place for some people. So it really it's a fraught issue.
It is, Monica, and I often think as willing and dedicated as family carers are, sometimes they are unable or unwilling to support someone with dementia in the home for the entirety of, you know, of their journey with dementia. We know they experience high stress, burnout, and yeah, if there is no alternative of a residential aged care facility for the person they're caring for, I think that's going to be a huge issue.
Monica, can I ask a question? Thank you. That was really interesting. I found that fascinating. I took a lot of notes. Where did you find a lot of the consumers to interview and to be involved in this research? Because I know Sarah and I and a couple of other people, we've been running some focus groups for people with younger onset dementia and trying to, you know, initiate new services, but it's really challenging to even find consumers. So I'm really curious about that.
It is. It used to be easier because you know, before the NDIS came along, we had, you know, there were quite strong networks within the aged care industry, you know, that were working specifically with young people with dementia. And then the NDIS came along, and a lot of that had to be severed because aged care organisations had to pull back from delivering these services. So our survey, you know, we really mined as many networks as we could. We kind of sent it out through all memory clinics and everywhere that we could to try and get, but still, you know, we only ended up with 160 people or so. It was very, very difficult. And so I don't really have an answer to this. You know, they are hard to find. They're more online, they're more digitally connected. You know, they are somehow easier to find than older people with dementia sometimes. But engaging them in research is a challenge. And often I'll go through things like memory clinics to try and find, and specialist services to try and find people. I could connect you with the team at neuropsychiatry at Royal Melbourne Hospital if you're not already connected to them, because they do a lot of diagnosis of young people with dementia.
Yeah, thank you, because I think that's the other part, the other piece of this complex puzzle, I guess, is when new services are launched, there's not the uptake that we would expect, because there are the numbers statistically, these people are out there, but I'm guessing we're just not connecting with the marketing kind of platforms that they're accessing, or we're coming from an aged care perspective and they're not looking at aged care services because they've got NDIS funding, or that's where their eligibility lies. So it's as you say, it's very complicated, and it really we've got a bit of a way to go.
Yeah, it is. And I think, here in South Australia, we have one aged care organisation who has a very long-standing reputation as working with this population very well. And so, they have just developed that reputation over like decades. And so that's where everybody goes. And it takes a very long time. And that's, for them, they've had to do a huge amount of work with local area coordinators, with support coordinators around the place to kind of say, hey, we're still here, we're still doing stuff. But yes, it's not easy. And I think this individualized funding model of like, I just access solo private practitioners when I need them is really changing things.
Yeah. And I wonder, is it all right if I open up that question a little bit to the Dementia Australia representatives here today as to whether you have any contacts through local area coordinators, on a personal level, or whether you offer training, or is there any integration that anybody here knows about between Dementia Australia and the NDIA? Is there kind of, training for staff, or a personal contact that potentially could be, a conduit for accessing, these two worlds sort of colliding? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was the whole point of the local area coordinators, right? They're supposed to be the ones that are the conduits. So I'm interested to hear as well.
I don't know if anyone, might be Bernadette typing away. Sorry, we need that elevator music again, Sarah. No. Yeah, it's tricky. And I think the social side of things as well is really fascinating, Monica, because I started my career in disability and then moved into aged care, and Sarah and I personally became aware of each other and connected through a very complex young man diagnosed with younger onset dementia. I don't know, Sarah, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, a long time. So he sat within the aged care system back then with what was an HD package, also had an individual support package through disability. Fabulous case study for the integration of these worlds even back then, because we had meetings across, there was I think she was called a case manager through the ISP. Sarah was sort of supporting a day respite option, and then in-home support through staff that work with Sarah's organisation at Caledonia. And then we would fund the carer support sort of, package supporting the family. Really complex, but it was such a good example of all of what you've spoken about, where, we planned together, we didn't sort of duplicate assessments, everybody brought the information they had, we pooled resources and ended up offering a really comprehensive, package of support, I guess, suite of services for this family. Now, Bernadette.
Can you hear me from this computer?
Yes.
I gave up on my computer, who knows? No, we don't have any direct contacts with the local area coordinators, just intermittently with individuals. So we haven't been able to set up, because they keep changing their offer, and who knows who's the next. So no, we don't. That hasn't been easy to do. And the other part of that is if people need some support or education, we've got lots of short online, what is dementia, how do you support? So we don't have the capacity or the time to be doing training, but there are free services on our website that they can access as part of their professional development. So that's the best we can do at the moment, I think. But that's what they need. They really need lots of training. And again, because most of the support workers working directly with the clients, they keep changing. You can only update 1 or 2 or 3, and then in 2 weeks or 2 months, there's a new support worker. So the system itself is still not quite working smoothly. But yeah,
the turnover in the disability system in NDIS is like, I thought,
it's burnout.
oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. And my aged care is a bit the same because they're so short of staff now. Yeah, it's not a great system yet, hopefully.
Thank you. And I think, again, that reminds, myself, and I know Sarah and I try to connect some of these sort of gaps. And, when we do recognize that there obviously is a big need there. So maybe Sarah and I will need to get back on to chasing up the NDIA and trying to get a local area coordinator or a group of them to attend these types of meetings and,
perfect,
as a standing regular agenda kind of item, whether they just come and listen in or contribute what their findings are or what they're being asked for by clients who come across their
because they don't network with us at all.
Okay.
I think that really speaks to what I was saying before about, that local area coordinator might have, in South Australia, they might have 10, the whole service might have 10 people with dementia, kind of, that they're, compared to thousands of people with autism or thousands of people with intellectual disability or whatever. And I think that is the challenge that I'm really grappling with from a research perspective and a clinical perspective. It's like, how do we get them to care? Needs are high, but the incidence is low. Like that's where I feel.
And we have the same problem. Like we do not have a good representation of younger onset clients because they just don't find us. And we try really hard to work with the geriatricians and the other services like, the Sarah and Elizabeth, the Cadams. They just don't often get to us. Yeah, I'm on there.
And one wonders where they go, like what are they doing?
I don't know where they go.
And then they say to us, to researchers, or they say to everyone that I don't know what I'm doing. There's no help, and it's like there's something going on. There's like a clog in the system somewhere.
Hello, it's Donna here. I'm from the Clinical Mental Health Services, aged care. Something we've noticed is that the demarcation between aged care and the NDIS certainly is a thing that we've noticed, and it's also led to the block funding being for the aged care services and then the individualised funding for the NDIS, and that it's sort of come at a cost to some of the programs that were out there that everyone knew about, like the the younger onset dementia groups, the planned activity groups. All those things have all gone now, and also the network meetings that used to be around aren't there so much anymore. So there's not the networking between the different services. It is more siloed, which makes it hard. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I suppose individuals have their bucket of funding and they can choose where they go, but then all the services they're going for are those individual carer, companion, individual social support. The infrastructure of the groups and the activities is not there so much.
Absolutely. So, again, that if you're in the aged care system and you have that block funding, you have to, there's so many administrative hoops that you have to go through to get NDIS registered, and like this whole thing, it becomes like there's just such kind of structural barriers. And I think one model I have seen kind of working quite well are organisations that deliver both disability and aged care services. So they're quite large organisations, and their integration can occur a little bit within the organisation, which is good. But of course, you need to be a very large organisation to be able to do that.
Sorry, Monica, you don't necessarily. We're a small organisation that only does dementia, which has meant we've kept our aged care funding, plus we take NDIS, plus private, plus those few people who perhaps are under 65 and don't have NDIS funding. So it can be done. Maybe we just need to model that across some different areas.
Yeah.
And I think, again, Sarah, it's that point that Monica made around, you put it beautifully, Monica, I should have written it down, something about the need being really great, but the numbers are low, so it's not a priority for a lot of organisations. And, that's the big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can hang on
a business case and they need X number of clients to bring in income, that's difficult. And the only organisation I know of here in South Australia who does that well, like I said, is really they've got a monopoly on the whole market because they're so well known. And so, you know, over decades they've developed that monopoly really. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Mm. Oh, thank you very much. That was a really great presentation. I wonder, are we able to secure a copy of that presentation, or at least some parts of it? I know there was a link to something else, a few little stats and things that I think might be really good for,
yeah, of course,
a few of us to.
I agree.
Oh,
It was excellent information, and yeah, good food for thought too.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Any other questions for Monica? I think we're right on time. No? Oh, Nan?
Oh, that was a clap. Sorry.
Apologies. Thank you so much, Monica. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Monica. It's been a great session.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.